So after quite a break, continue this morning looking at Hebrews chapter 11. And this morning we're going to read verses 29 to 31. And you'll see the relevance of the passages that we read together earlier on as we read them. By faith, the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land. But the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. The relationship between faith and works is a theme that recurs throughout the Bible. And nowhere is that more true than here in Hebrews chapter 11. Here we have one example after another of men and women of faith. People in whose lives that faith was manifested by what they did, by their works. The reality of their faith in Yahweh was seen by how they lived. Coming then to verses 29 to 31, again, faith and works in these verses are very much to the fore. The writer takes these examples that the writer takes from the Exodus and from the conquest of Canaan. We can use them, I think, to help us to understand that relationship between faith and works better. And the first thing I'd like us to notice then from verse 29 is that works without faith lead to death. Works without faith lead to death. So the writer invites us here to consider two groups of people, two nations. On the one hand, we have Israel, the people of God, escaping from tyranny and bondage in Egypt. And on the other hand, we have Egypt, their enemy, pursuing them and seeking to keep them or to bring them back into that slavery. And the scene that's set before us in verse 29 is an action scene of epic proportions. We have this great path opened up through the sea with the massive walls of water on either side. And through this miraculous roadway, these two nations are passing on dry land, both of them doing exactly the same thing. And yet the outcome could not be more different. The Israelites then, they arrived safely on the eastern shore and look behind them at the pursuing Egyptians. Things are very different for them. They're equipped with the latest military hardware. They have their chariots, and yet the wheels of those chariots are sinking into the mud. And too late, they realize that they are in great peril, and so they turn to flee. And at the command of God, his servant Moses stretches out his hand across the sea, and the path that had previously opened up, it closes. Those walls of water on either side, they come crashing down, and the pride of Pharaoh's army is completely submerged by the sea. Exodus 14 verse 30 sums up those events. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. How then are we to explain this outcome? The same action by both nations, and yet two utterly contrasting results. Well, the writer of the letter to the Hebrews gives a very succinct explanation. Those two words that we've become very, very familiar with by now. By faith. By faith, the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land. But the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. The Israelites crossed successfully by faith. The Egyptians, in their attempt to cross without faith, were destroyed. So let's look in a little bit more detail at these two groups. The people of Israel had the promise that God had given them through Moses. Exodus 14, verse 13. And Moses said to the people, "Fear not, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today shall never be seen again. The Lord will fight for you. You have only to be silent." Imagine that situation that these people were in after all those long years of slavery in Egypt, after that great deliverance that took place on the Passover night. But now here they were with this impassable barrier in front of them, the Red Sea, and behind them is the might of the Egyptian army. Surely they're facing the prospect of either imminent death or a return to slavery. But God tells them to be quiet. He tells them to stand still and to witness his salvation. He makes this great promise to them. And on the basis of this promise alone, he gives a command through Moses. The Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward." Verse 15. And so the people hear that promise from God, and they believe his promise. And on the basis of his bare word, they act. Verse 22, Exodus 14. And the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. What circumstances those were, weren't they? Going into that pathway through the sea, these vast quantities of water piled up on either side of them that could come crashing down at any moment. But God had said that that wouldn't happen. And so his people took him at his word and they went forward. Come now to the Egyptians, and they did exactly the same thing. They saw an opportunity. They must have said to themselves, well, if Israel can do that, if they can go through that path, through the sea, why not us? But here's the difference. Crucially, they had no promise or command from the Lord. Their actions in going into the middle of the sea didn't flow from faith. Rather, the opposite was true. Their actions actually flowed from their own hardness of heart. Verse 17 of Exodus 14. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they shall go in after them. And I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, his chariots and his horsemen. So the Egyptians, they pursued the people of Israel, but they did so wickedly, in defiance of God. God had expressly told Pharaoh that he must let the people go. Too late, they realized the truth. They realized that God was fighting for the Egyptians. Fighting for Israel. Let us flee from before Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians. So like Israel then, the Egyptians acted. They went forward into the path that the Lord had created. But unlike Israel, they did so not on the basis of any of God's promises. No, they were driven only by their greed and obstinacy. Both of those nations then had what we might call works. In the case of Israel, their works going into the sea flowed from faith, and that led to life and salvation for them. In the case of the Egyptians, their works came from unbelief, and they led to death and destruction. We need to remember, of course, who the first people were who were reading this letter to the Hebrews. They were Jewish Christians, and many of these people were being tempted down a particular pathway, the pathway of works. They were being tempted to return to religious ritual, to the sacrifices, to the priesthood, to the temple. But the people who were trying to get them to go down that pathway were blind to the one whom those things truly pointed to. They were blind to the fact that those things pointed to God's promised Messiah, Jesus. And so as people hung on to all those rituals, they were not doing so by faith. No, they were relying on the rituals rather than the one whom those rituals signified. They were resting on the ceremonies rather than the promises that were fulfilled, that were illustrated by those ceremonies. Theirs was the pathway of works, but not works flowing from faith and leading to life. Rather, it was a pathway of works without faith, leading to death. And not just physical death beneath the waters of the Red Sea. No, eternal death, separation from God and separation from all that's good forever in hell. And I just want to ask you this morning a serious question. Are you in danger of doing something similar? So you look around you and you see what Christians do. You see that they go to church. You see that they read their Bibles. You see that they pray. You see that they give money. And you want the same salvation that they've got. And so you think, well, I need to do those things. The problem is, in doing those things, your actions are not springing from faith. They're not a response to God's gracious offer of salvation. They don't come from believing his promises and from taking him at his words. You might go through the motions outwardly. You might do those things that Christians do. You might have works without faith. But works without faith are useless. They won't save you. Ultimately, they're evidence of hardness of heart, as in the case of those Egyptians, and they will lead to eternal death. Let me urge you this morning then, don't be satisfied with works without faith. Rather, come to Jesus Christ and trust in him. Exercise faith in him, and then works will flow from that faith. Not works that will save you, but works that will manifest gratitude and love to him for all that he is and all that he has done for you. Second thing that we can notice from these verses is in verse 30, that works make faith visible. Works make faith visible. So the writer of this letter moves on in the history of Israel, from the crossing of the Red Sea to the events that are recorded in Joshua chapter 6, the conquest of Jericho, this city that stood in the way of God's people as they entered into the land of Canaan. And we read, by faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. And in the light of these words, then, I'd like to ask a question. What was it that caused those walls of Jericho to collapse? Was it the faith of the people of Israel? Was it the actions of the people of Israel? Well, according to Joshua chapter 6 and verse 2, it was neither of those things. And the Lord said to Joshua, see, I have given Jericho into your hand with its king and mighty men of valor. Then a bit further on in the chapter, verse 16, and at the 7th time, when the priests had blown the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. So the crumbling of those city walls, the overthrow of the inhabitants of the city, it wasn't down to the faith of these people or their actions. These people did not conquer Jericho. They simply marched through its ruined walls because God had already destroyed the city and had already routed its inhabitants. But that raises the question, why does Hebrews 11 verse 30 speak about the faith and the actions of Israel? Surely those things are irrelevant if the whole thing is down to the Lord. Joshua chapter 6 is full of human activity. The men of war marched around the city once a day for 6 days. Verse 3. On the seventh day, they marched around for 7 times. And very detailed instructions are given about the priests and the ark and the blowing of the trumpets. So this whole thing was highly organized. We might compare it to the highly choreographed military parades that we see in our day. But what does all this activity contribute to the destruction of the wall? Well, we have to say nothing at all. There's no mention of digging tunnels under the wall or of erecting great siege engines, the sort of thing that any besieging army worth its salt might do. No, all that we have is marching and blowing trumpets and shouting. There's a lot of noise, there's a lot of activity, but none of that had the slightest effect on the city walls. So we have all of this busyness, all of this activity, and yet at the end of the day, none of it brought the conquest of Jericho a step closer. Let's ask another question. What would have happened if Joshua had said to the people, there's no point in you getting up early for 7 days. You might as well have an extra couple of hours in bed. The Lord's going to bring the wall down. We just need to wait for him to do it. What would have happened under those circumstances? Well, I think we can safely say that Jericho would have remained where it was. It would have remained standing. And the conquest of the land of Canaan would have been stopped in its tracks. So we have this situation then. The activity of the people contributed nothing to the destruction of Jericho. It was all down to the Lord. And yet if all that activity hadn't occurred, there would have been no demolition of the wall and no victory. How are we to explain that? Well, again, the key to understanding this is those little words, by faith, at the start of Hebrews 11 and verse 30. They signify God's people believing his promises, depending on him helplessly, looking to him to accomplish what they themselves are powerless to do. Why didn't Joshua and the people simply trust God? Why didn't they stand by and watch while the Lord brought the walls down? Well, the verse illustrates something that's found throughout Hebrews 11 and throughout the whole Bible, in fact, that true faith, where it exists, is never invisible. It always shows itself in actions. It always shows itself in works. You need to remember those works, they in themselves contribute nothing to the achievement of the goal, but they are the outward demonstration of the inward reality of trust in the Lord. Marching round those walls of Jericho, it could have been viewed as a completely pointless activity. But because those people believed God's promise, and because they relied on him, they showed that they were relying on him by following the pathway that he had appointed. Because they trusted in him, they were ready to obey him. How was that relevant then to those Jewish people to whom this letter was first written? Those people might have argued, well, what's the harm in going back to Judaism? Just adding a few ceremonies and a few rituals to faith in Christ. But the reality was that there was great harm in doing that. In the gospel, God had shown them that those ceremonies and those rituals had now been fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And so the way of obedience was not to go back to those Old Testament ways. To do so was to choose the way of rebellion against God's appointed way. It was to demonstrate unbelief rather than faith. It was replacing God's way through faith in Jesus Christ with my way by following the rituals and the ceremonies. And what does this verse have to say to us this morning? If you're a Christian here this morning, then you know that you are saved by faith in Christ alone. Nothing that you can do can contribute anything whatsoever to putting yourself right with God. So you might then go on to argue, well, what's the point then in being baptized? What's the point in becoming a committed member of a local church? What value is there in taking the Lord's Supper regularly? What value is there in observing the Lord's Day? None of those things contribute in the slightest to justifying you before God. Viewed in themselves, we might think they have very little value and that we can dispense of them without too much loss. But no, we need to remember that this is the way that God has appointed for those whom he has saved, and that true faith is made visible by obedience to God's commands, by choosing his way and not my way. Of course, we have to say that all the things that I just described do bring great benefit to the believer if they're practiced through faith in Jesus Christ. God has designed them that way to bring great benefit. But that's not the ultimate reason for doing them. We do them because that's what God has commanded. And he is the God in whom we put our faith. He is the God in whom we trust. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. And then thirdly, this morning, I'd like us to notice that faith produces works in the most unlikely places. Faith produces works in the most unlikely places. This is verse 31. So as this writer moves from Hebrews 11, verse 8 to verse 30, the people of faith who are described are Abraham and his descendants. They are what we might call the covenant line, those successive generations to whom God has committed himself in covenant faithfulness, those whom he has chosen to be his own special possession, the objects of his kindness and favor. But when we come to verse 31, there's an abrupt departure from that line. We have this woman called Rahab, this Canaanite woman who was a citizen of Jericho. And she belonged to the nations whom God had promised to drive out of the promised land and whom he had commanded Israel to destroy. Rahab can't trace her lineage back to Abraham. She's not a worshipper of the true and living God. She's ignorant of him. She's devoted instead to the false idol gods of the Canaanites. And that's not all. The writer doesn't spare her blushes as he describes her occupation. He describes her as Rahab the prostitute. She's not only a pagan, but she's one who earned her living by putting that pagan morality into practice. And her life was given over to behavior that was completely at odds with the standards of the God of Israel. So all things considered then, we have to say that Rahab's home is a very unlikely place to look for faith in the God of Israel. And yet here she is in this chapter. She's listed alongside Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and Moses. In Joshua chapter 6, verse 17, God had commanded the destruction of Jericho and its inhabitants. There's no reason to believe that Rahab was any less deserving of that destruction than her fellow Jerichoites. And yet, as those walls of the city came crashing down, there was one house that remained standing, Rahab's home on the city wall. And as those Israelite soldiers poured into the city, there was one family that was spared slaughter, and that was Rahab and her household. Let's go back for a moment to the book of Joshua and chapter 6. And in verse 21 we read, "Then they," that's the people of Israel, "devoted all in the city to destruction, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys with the edge of the sword. But to the two men who had spied out the land, Joshua said, 'Go into the prostitute's house and bring out from there the woman and all who belong to her, as you swore to her. So the young men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and mother and brothers and all who belonged to her. And they brought all her relatives, and put them outside the camp of Israel. And they burned the city with fire and everything in it. Only the silver and the gold and the vessels of bronze and of iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. But Rahab the prostitute and her father's household and all who belonged to her, Joshua saved alive. And she has lived in Israel to this day, because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. What distinguished this woman then from those fellow pagans around her who were put to the sword? Well, again, we have that simple answer in the text. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient. This woman, despite all of her pagan background, she had heard what God had done for Israel. We turn back a few pages to Joshua chapter 2 and verse 8. We read there, "Before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that as I have dealt kindly with you, you also will deal kindly with my father's house and give me a sure sign, that you will save alive my father and my mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death." So this woman acknowledged the God of Israel to be the one true and living God, and she entrusted herself and her loved ones to his care. But how do we know that these were not just words? She was just saying the right thing. Well, again, we see that her faith produced works. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. She hid those men, and she did so at great personal risk to herself. Here she was, identifying with this invading force, fraternizing with the enemies of her people. Surely that would have meant certain death if she'd been found out. It's the last behavior that you would have expected of a pagan woman. But the reality was that Rahab was no longer a pagan. She had become a believer in the God of Israel. And as always, when you have a believer, when faith is present, it's manifested in works. This woman, Rahab, recognized that Yahweh was worthy of trust. And so she was ready to face great personal danger in order to trust in him and see the great deliverance that he would bring about. In his New Testament letter, James draws on her example. He's arguing that true faith is always accompanied by works. And in James chapter 2, verse 25, he goes as far as saying, "Was not Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way?" Why does he put it in these strong terms? He's not saying that her friendly reception of the spies earned merit with God, but what he is saying, that her actions showed that the faith through which she was saved was real faith. It was genuine. Again, let's go back to those Jewish Christians reading this letter. These people were tempted to go back to the temple worship, to the priesthood, and so on. They were tempted to go back to things that were exclusively Jewish, things that their Gentile fellow believers had no part in. And so the writer directs them to this woman, Rahab. And in doing so, he wants to jolt them into realizing that they're going in the wrong direction. This Gentile woman, way back in Old Testament history, she's a signpost that God's saving plan is not confined to the nation of Israel. It was already embracing pagans like this woman. And the faith of this woman was displayed by her trusting in the God of Israel. So far from going back into Jewish exclusivism, these people receiving this letter, they needed to recognize the worldwide scope of the gospel, and they needed to embrace their non-Jewish brothers and sisters. But I wonder this morning, do you perhaps in some way identify with this woman, Rahab? Maybe as you think about your background, you can say, well, I haven't had the privilege of being brought up in a Christian family that some of the people around me have had. I lack many of the advantages that they've had in their lives. And as I think about my past way of life, then I have to say, well, what would my fellow church members say if they knew the things that I'd done? Well, I want you this morning then to take courage and comfort from the example of this woman, Rahab. This woman who threw herself helplessly on the mercy of the true and living God. And this woman whose faith was manifested in obedience, that has stood as a beacon for Christians down through the centuries. Indeed, in the goodness of God, this woman was entrusted with being in the line of the Messiah, as you can read in Matthew chapter 1, verse 5. This woman who trusted in Israel's God, along with the Jewish men and women of faith, was one who was able to look forward to that city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. And if you're trusting in Jesus Christ this morning, no matter what your background, no matter how ashamed you are of that background maybe, no matter how few advantages you've had, if you are trusting in Jesus Christ this morning, then you can have the same hope that this woman had. Amen.